These are companies with decades and decades of well-documented lying to the American public.
Those who complained were fired, stripped of responsibilities, or forced out.
As we started feeding the GMO corns to our animals, we started experiencing huge reproductive problems.
Rats that were fed genetically modified tomato developed stomach lesions, bleeding stomachs. 7 out of 40 died within 2 weeks, and the tomato was approved.
What did the FDA administrators do? They had ignored, overridden their own scientist statements.
Tragically, children are most at risk from the potential dangers of genetically engineered foods.
The biotech industry claims that genetically engineered foods are safe, but scientists and investigators around the world disagree. New evidence suggests that industry pressure and political collusion force these foods onto the market, and their effects on health, particularly on kids, may be serious.
To create a genetically engineered food, you take a gene from one species and you put the gene into the DNA of another species. Now, typically they do this because they want to add a trait. Like they take, for example, a gene that creates a pesticide and they put it into corn so that the corn will create a pesticide. The process of genetic engineering can disrupt the normal functioning of the DNA in dramatic ways. It can turn genes off, permanently turn them on, change their levels of expression, and create all sorts of unpredicted production of allergies, toxins, carcinogens, nutrient problems, etc.
When we got the FDA's documents and began to analyze them, we found something very shocking. That not only did the scientists who had joined our lawsuit have concern about genetically engineered foods, not only did hundreds of other scientists around the world have concern about the potential hazards of genetically engineered foods, but the FDA's own scientific staff had the same concerns. The overwhelming consensus within the FDA's own scientific staff was genetic engineering is inherently hazardous, it is very different than conventional breeding, and every food that is modified through it, every food that's been genetically engineered, has to be carefully safety tested because it runs the risk of harboring unintended harmful substances such as new poisons, new allergens.
But their superiors were under orders from the White House to promote the biotechnology industry.
They were only told, we need to have this technology moving and moving fast, and we need to have a whole new industrial sector in place.
And the person in charge of policy was a former attorney for the large biotech company Monsanto.
What did the FDA administrators do? They had ignored, overridden their own scientist statements and presumed that all of these foods are safe.
No long-term safety studies, no safety studies whatsoever are required before foods are put on the market.
And that's like saying you make a car and the producer of the car doesn't test it, will let some people, get killed driving the car to see if it is safe or not. It's an absurd position, but that is the position of a lot of the people who are promoting this technology.
People were saying in the industry and the regulatory agencies that if the American people want progress, they're going to have to be the guinea pigs.
Now, there are so many loopholes and flaws in the current regulatory regime for assessing the safety of genetically engineered food that I consider this framework to be little more than a regulatory facade which enables food producers to claim that their products have been properly tested and to help persuade consumers that genetically engineered foods are safe.
They wanted to get something through that gave at least the illusion that this was being tested.
Rats that were fed genetically modified tomato developed stomach lesions, bleeding stomachs. 7 out of 40 died within 2 weeks, and the tomato was approved. Rats fed genetically modified soy had misshapen nuclei in their liver cells. Rats fed genetically modified canola had livers that were heavier. Rats that were fed genetically modified corn had problems in the development of their blood cells. Chicken fed genetically modified corn died at twice the rate of those fed non-genetically modified corn. 12 cows died mysteriously in Germany when being fed genetically modified corn. And several Midwestern farmers report that when they feed genetically modified corn to their pigs, the pigs have reproductive problems.
The mother hogs were going into their full pregnancies, and instead of a normal litter of babies, they would deliver bags of water, or they wouldn't do anything. As we worked our way through this, we found, through word of mouth and media coverage, another 25 farmers in 5 states that had exactly the same problems.
Our whole problem was the fact that we were not getting sows pregnant. It wasn't just us, but there was a lot of people in the area that had the same problem. So we figured out that everybody was feeding the same seed corn.
We've had trouble with conception rates. We did testing, did everything, nothing worked. We're finding out it's traced clear back to the seed corn. It makes you wonder with the genetic modified stuff, what we're finding out now with it, and we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, I think.
I had one gentleman in Nebraska. He was feeding the BT corn to the sows, and he had trouble with the conception of that group of sows. He switched away from using that BT corn, and the problem went away.
If thalidomide had not caused dramatic birth defects, but rather cancer or other allergenic responses, it would still in all probability be in supply because of the difficulty of linking cause and effect.
If there were reproductive problems that were caused by genetically modified foods, or problems in liver cell development or bleeding stomachs, who would know that it was genetically modified foods? No one is monitoring. An example of how difficult it is to discover the cause of a problem came in the 1980s. There was an epidemic. About 100 people died and 5,000 to 10,000 people fell sick. They finally traced it back to a food supplement that had been created from the process of genetic modification. Only the brand that was genetically modified caused this disease. Now, the only reason that they were able to discover that it was an epidemic was that the disease had 3 simultaneous characteristics. It was rare, it was acute, and it came on quickly. If any one of these 3 characteristics had not been in place, that same deadly food supplement might still be on the market.
I think that the main problem is likely to be this long-term effect of GM. I think that the simplest analogy is smoking. How long did it take for smoking, the effects of smoking to be uncovered? 30, 40 years?
Look it over like in Vietnam where they sprayed Agent Orange. Didn't think that was going to hurt. Well, could be the same thing with genetically modified products too.
We know that soon after genetically modified soy was introduced into the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed there by 50%. Now, we can't say that it was definitely the genetic modification of the soy, but we do know that soy has an increase in trypsin inhibitor, the most commonly known soy allergen. But we also know that you can transfer allergens into genetically modified foods. In fact, the process of genetically engineering soy disrupted the DNA and caused a damaged section, which could, in theory, create an allergenic protein. Also, the gene which they inserted into the soy rearranged over time without explanation. So it's creating actually a slightly different protein, one that was never tested or predicted or intended to be produced inside the soy, and that might be allergenic or toxic. So there's a lot of reasons why a genetic modified food could create an increase in allergies. In the UK, they took a genetically modified potato and they fed it to rats. And the rats ended up with potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles due to retarded development of the organs, partial atrophy of the liver, and a damaged immune system. And it remains the most in-depth animal feeding study ever published on the safety of genetically engineered foods. And it shows that these foods might inherently be unsafe. Dr. Arpad Pustai, before the study was completed, was invited to speak on television. And he expressed his concerns about genetically engineered foods and how the public is being used as guinea pigs in an uncontrolled experiment. When news of his research came out, he was a hero for 2 days at his prestigious institute. But then on a Tuesday evening, 2 phone calls were allegedly placed from the Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the institute's director. The next morning, Wednesday morning, Arpad Pustai was fired after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit.